My name is Julio, and for 53 years, I believed I had everything figured out. I built my company from scratch, turned it into an empire, and made more money than I ever thought possible. People respected me. Some feared me, but no one could say I wasn't successful. The price? I barely saw my family. Friendships faded. My health was just an afterthought, but that never really bothered me. In my mind, life was a game, and the only thing that mattered was winning. That was until the day everything collapsed. One moment, I was reviewing financial reports in my office. The next, I was sitting in a doctor's office, hearing the words that would rip my world apart. It's cancer, and it's aggressive. The tumor had spread further than I ever imagined. There was no easy fix, no negotiation to be made. The only real chance was surgery. A dangerous one. If I survived, I might have more time. If I didn't, well, I tried not to think about that. But as they wheeled me into the operating room, something inside me whispered that I should. And then, as soon as the anesthesia hit, I was gone. At first, there was nothing, just darkness. I wasn't dreaming, I wasn't floating, I simply wasn't. But then, like a switch had been flipped, I was there, standing. A vast emptiness stretched around me, but it wasn't just blackness. It had depth, like a space that wasn't meant to be seen. And in front of me, suspended in the void, was a massive clock. It wasn't attached to anything, no gears, no chains, just floating. Its hands moved in a way that made no sense, erratic and unpredictable. 1 second, they crawled so slowly I could barely see them shift. The next, they lurched forward as if time itself was being swallowed. I felt something in my chest, an unease, a pressure. This wasn't just any clock. It was my time. The more I stared, the more I understood. Every tick, every movement was tied to me. It wasn't counting in minutes or hours. It was reacting to something deeper. And then it happened. The second hand jolted forward violently, spinning ahead, as if it was trying to catch up. And with each tick, I saw flashes, memories, but not random ones, specific moments. Every time I had chosen work over my son's soccer game. Every time I ignored a call from my mother because I was too busy. Every deal where I stepped on someone just to get ahead. The faster the clock moved, the more I felt it. A deep, overwhelming dread. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The images kept coming, faster and sharper. I saw the night I missed my daughter's school play because I was closing a deal in another city. I saw my father lying in a hospital bed, waiting for me to visit, waiting until it was too late. I saw faces I had long forgotten, people I had hurt, friendships I had let die. And with each painful realization, the clock hands spun faster, as if my time was slipping through my fingers. My chest tightened. Was this it? Was I watching my life being measured, weighed, and discarded? But then, something changed. The clock slowed. Not completely, but noticeably. The images shifted. Softer memories. I saw the time I helped an old colleague get back on his feet after a rough patch. The night I stayed up, comforting my son when he had a nightmare. The moment I chose to forgive instead of retaliate. These moments were fewer, scattered between decades of selfishness, but they mattered. With each one, the ticking grew steadier, almost gentle. And that's when I understood. This wasn't just about how much time I had left. It was about how I had spent it. Panic crawled up my spine as I realized the pattern. The moments of selfishness, greed, and indifference made the clock spiral out of control, devouring my time. But the rare instances of kindness and connection slowed it down, as if they gave me more time. I wanted to grab the clock, to stop the hands, to undo everything I had done wrong. But I couldn't move. I could only watch. My entire life was being calculated, second by second, action by action. And the terrifying part? It wasn't just about what I had done. It was about what I had failed to do. A cold realization settled in my gut. If I had died at that moment, my time would have run out sooner than it should have. Not because of fate, not because of some random biological clock, but because of the way I had lived. I had taken, and taken, but given so little back. And then, as if the clock had reached some final, irreversible conclusion, the hands froze. Everything went silent. No ticking, no movement, just stillness. And in that stillness, a thought emerged, clear and undeniable. Was this it? Was my time up? For a moment, I thought everything was over, that I was about to disappear into that emptiness, swallowed by the weight of my own life. But then, just as abruptly as it had stopped, the clock ticked backward. Not much, just a single hesitant movement, a crack of possibility. My heart pounded. Did this mean I still had time? That I could change something? I wanted to scream, to plead for another chance, but I had no voice. All I could do was feel, and the feeling was clear. The choice had never been about when I would die, but how I would live with what was left. And then, everything collapsed. The clock, the darkness, the unbearable weight of time. It all imploded in on itself. I felt like I was being pulled, yanked away from that space by something beyond my control. A rush of sound filled my ears, and suddenly, I was back. My eyes flew open, and I was staring at a blinding hospital light, beeping monitors, muffled voices. My body felt heavy, like I had been buried under reality itself. A doctor leaned over me, relief evident on his face. "Julio," he said, "you're awake. The surgery was a success." Success. That word used to mean everything to me. But lying there, gasping for air, it felt hollow. The surgery had gone well, but something inside me had shifted. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't even grateful. Not yet. I was terrified. That clock, those memories, that calculation of my existence, none of it had been a dream. I knew that. I had felt it in my bones, in a way that reality itself now seemed fragile in comparison. The doctor kept talking, saying something about my vitals and post-op care, but his voice was distant, drowned out by a single thought pounding in my skull. How much time do I have left? I turned my head slightly, scanning the room. Machines, IV lines, the faint smell of antiseptic. And then I saw it, a small clock on the wall, ticking away like any ordinary timepiece. But to me, it wasn't ordinary at all. My breath caught. For a second, just a second, I swore I saw its hands stutter. A tiny, imperceptible hesitation, as if it recognized me. My pulse spiked, and I had to close my eyes. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The real clock was still counting. And this time, I couldn't afford to waste a single second. The days after the surgery felt surreal. Everyone around me acted like I had just dodged a bullet, like I should be celebrating. My business partners sent flowers. My secretary left messages about meetings I had missed, and even my ex-wife called, offering polite concern. But none of it mattered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been given something rare, not just more time, but a warning. I kept replaying the vision in my head, trying to make sense of it. The clock, the way it reacted to my choices, the way it stopped. What did it mean for me now? Was it a second chance, or just a delayed sentence? I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. How could I? Who would believe me? I barely believed myself. But one thing was clear. I couldn't go back to who I was before. I tried at first. I checked emails, skimmed financial reports, even drafted a response to my board of directors. But the moment I reached for my phone, a wave of nausea hit me. Visceral, immediate, like my body itself was rejecting the life I used to live. I set the phone down, my hands trembling. For the first time in years, I felt something I had long forgotten, fear of running out of time. I started noticing things I had ignored for years. The way the nurses greeted me every morning, genuinely asking how I felt. The worried look in my son's eyes when he visited, as if he wasn't sure how to talk to me, the exhaustion in my ex-wife's face, a woman I had once loved but treated like an afterthought. These moments used to be invisible to me, background noise in the pursuit of success. But now, they stood out like flashing warning signs. I kept thinking about the clock. Was it still moving? Was it slowing? Was it too late? One night, unable to sleep, I sat up in bed and reached for the small clock on my bedside table. I held it in my hands, feeling the steady ticking against my fingers. Normal, ordinary, but I wasn't. I had seen something no one else had. I had felt my time slipping away, and now every second felt fragile. I wanted to believe I had control, that I could make the right choices and earn more time. But what if I failed? What if, despite everything, the clock was still racing toward an ending I couldn't escape? I knew I couldn't stay in that hospital room forever. The doctors discharged me a week later, advising rest, a new diet, and a follow-up schedule. But they had no idea what had really changed. Walking out of there, breathing in the city air, I felt like I was stepping into a world that had kept moving without me. Had I really lived like this? Rushing from one obligation to another? Blind to everything except my own goals? I used to think I was in control. But now, every ticking second felt like a reminder that I wasn't. The question wasn't how much time I had left, but what I would do with it. At home, everything felt wrong. My penthouse, once a symbol of my success, felt cold. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. I had built a life so efficient, so optimized, that I had no room for people. Only things. I stood in my own living room, surrounded by expensive furniture and artwork, and felt completely alone. That's when it hit me. If I died tomorrow, what would I really leave behind? Money? A company that would replace me in weeks? A name that meant nothing to the people who should have mattered the most? I sank into the nearest chair, gripping my temples. I had to change. But how? I tried to do what felt natural, distract myself. I opened my laptop, skimmed through unread emails, checked stock reports. But the moment I started typing a response, my fingers froze. It was like my body refused to cooperate. This isn't what matters. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. For years, I had convinced myself that work was everything, that building my empire was the only thing that gave my life meaning. But now, after everything I had seen, I wasn't so sure. The clock, the real one, was still counting, whether I looked at it or not, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that every wrong move might make it tick faster. So, I did something I hadn't done in years. I picked up my phone and called my son. He didn't answer at first. I imagined him staring at the screen, seeing my name, debating whether or not to pick up. Could I blame him? I had spent his entire childhood putting work first, showing up late, if at all, when it came to things that actually mattered. But just as I was about to hang up, his voice came through. "Dad?" He sounded hesitant, unsure. I swallowed hard. "Hey, Filio," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. "I was just wondering if we could talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for me to feel the weight of every missed call, every forgotten birthday, every moment I had chosen something else over him. "Talk about what?" he finally asked, his voice cautious, like he was waiting for me to ask for something. And maybe that was fair. Our relationship had been built on transactional conversations, me offering things instead of time, solutions instead of presence. I took a deep breath. "About anything. About you. About us." The words felt foreign in my mouth, but they were real. And for the first time, I wasn't saying them because I had to. I was saying them because I wanted to. He didn't respond right away, and I braced myself for rejection. Maybe it was too late. Maybe my clock had already ticked down in ways I couldn't undo. But then he sighed. Not an annoyed sigh. More like someone who wanted to believe but wasn't sure if they should. "All right," he said. "When?" The relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. Whenever you have time, I said quickly, then caught myself. No, that was the old me talking. No, actually, whenever you want, I'll make time. Another pause. Then, quietly, he said, okay. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in my life, I realized that something might just be enough to start. The next few days felt like walking on unfamiliar ground. I wanted to fix everything at once, to make up for lost time, to rewrite the years I had wasted. But life didn't work like that. Change wasn't immediate. It was awkward, slow, filled with missteps. My son and I agreed to meet for lunch, and when the day finally came, I found myself nervous. Not like before a business deal or a board meeting. This was different. This was personal. When I arrived at the restaurant, he was already there, scrolling through his phone. For a second, I wondered if he even cared that I was coming. But then, as I sat down, he looked up and gave me a small nod. Not much, but enough. We talked about simple things at first. Work, school, movies. It was clumsy, like two strangers figuring each other out. But as the conversation went on, something shifted. He mentioned a memory, something from when he was little, before I was too busy to notice. You used to take me to the beach, he said, stirring his drink. I don't remember much, but I remember that. I swallowed hard. I had forgotten, but he hadn't. That single fleeting moment had stayed with him. And if a single memory could matter that much, maybe it wasn't too late to make more. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind restless. The lunch had gone better than I expected, but I couldn't stop thinking about what my son had said. I don't remember much, but I remember that. It made me wonder, how many other moments had I missed? How many small, seemingly insignificant things could have been meaningful if I had just been paying attention? The thought made my chest tighten. I had spent decades chasing big accomplishments, thinking they were what defined a life well lived. But in the end, it wasn't the awards, the deals, or the numbers in my bank account that mattered. It was time. And I had spent most of mine on the wrong things. I turned my head toward the clock on my nightstand. Just a regular digital display glowing in the dark. But something about it made my stomach drop. I couldn't shake the feeling that time wasn't just moving. It was watching me, measuring me, judging whether I was truly changing or just fooling myself. I exhaled slowly and closed my eyes. I needed to do more. Not just one lunch, not just one phone call. I needed to prove to myself, to whatever force had shown me that vision, that I had learned something. Because if I hadn't, if I was still the same man I had been before that surgery, then maybe the clock was already winding down to zero. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my ex-wife, Anna. I hesitated before dialing, knowing she had every reason not to pick up. Our marriage had ended not in a dramatic explosion, but in something worse: neglect. I had let the distance grow, assuming love could survive on autopilot while I buried myself in work. When she finally answered, her voice was guarded. Julio? I cleared my throat. Hey, Anna. I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing. A silence stretched between us, long enough that I almost regretted calling. Then, she let out a dry laugh. Now you care? The words stung, but I couldn't blame her. I do, I said, meaning it. I know it's late, maybe too late, but I've been thinking a lot about things, about how I was, about how much I stopped myself. What was I even trying to say? That I was sorry? That I suddenly wanted to be a better person? Apologies felt small in the face of years of absence. I don't expect anything from you, I said instead. I just wanted to hear your voice. Another silence. This time, though, it felt different, softer. I don't know what's going on with you, Julio, she said finally, her tone less sharp. But, okay, I'm listening. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. That call with Anna stayed with me for the rest of the day. It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was something. A crack in the wall I had built over the years. I kept thinking about how easy it had been to push people away, how simple it was to let life become a cycle of work, success, and isolation. But now that I was trying to do the opposite, I realized something uncomfortable. I didn't know how to be present. What did normal people even do with their time? How did they balance ambition with relationships? I had no answers, only the gnawing feeling that I was running against the clock. That night, I had another dream. Or maybe it wasn't a dream at all. I was standing in the same vast darkness as before, facing the clock. Its hands twitched, moving erratically. But this time, I wasn't just watching. I could feel it. Every tick echoed in my chest, like my heartbeat was linked to it. I wanted to reach out, to stop it, to understand what it wanted from me. But before I could, the hands lurched forward, spinning wildly. My stomach dropped. Was I losing time again? Had I done something wrong? A voice, calm yet absolute, whispered in the void, "You decide." And just like that, I woke up, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. The dream, or vision, or whatever it was, felt too real to ignore. The voice still echoed in my mind. "You decide." Decide what? My fate? My time? Was this some kind of warning? Or was I being tested? I ran a hand down my face, trying to steady my breathing. The clock on my nightstand showed 3:47 a.m. I stared at it, half expecting it to glitch, to move erratically like the one in my vision. But it didn't. It just kept ticking, steady and indifferent. I had no proof that any of this meant something, no way to explain it logically. And yet, deep down, I knew. I couldn't ignore it. By morning, I had made a decision. No more hesitation. No more waiting for things to fix themselves. If my time was running out, I had to use it, not just fear it. I grabbed my phone and started dialing numbers I hadn't in years. Old friends, colleagues I had once respected, but lost touch with. Some didn't answer. Some did. Hesitant, surprised, even suspicious. I didn't blame them. I just wanted to reconnect, I told each one. No reason, just felt like it was time. Some conversations were short, awkward, others lasted longer than I expected. But each one, in its own way, felt like a thread being rewoven, like I was pulling myself back into a life I had abandoned. As the days passed, I kept pushing myself to show up, to be present in ways I never had before. I visited my mother, who I hadn't seen in months. The look on her face when she opened the door nearly broke me. She didn't say much at first, just pulled me into a tight hug, and I let her. For once, I didn't check my phone, didn't think about work. We sat in her small living room, drinking coffee, talking about nothing and everything. At one point, she looked at me with a knowing gaze and said, "You're different." I swallowed hard. "I hope so." She nodded, as if she understood more than I was saying. Maybe she did. But despite the progress, despite the moments that felt real and meaningful, the fear never left me. Every night, I would wake up, expecting to see that giant floating clock looming over me. Sometimes I swore I could hear the ticking in my dreams, even when I didn't see it. Was I doing enough? Was I really changing? Or just trying to outrun something inevitable? The doubt was always there, whispering that maybe this was all too little, too late. And then, one night, something happened that made that fear feel more real than ever. Because this time, when I woke up, I wasn't alone in the room. At first, I thought it was just the lingering effects of a dream. My room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the digital clock on my nightstand. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, a figure standing at the foot of my bed. My body went rigid. It wasn't like those half-awake hallucinations people talk about. This was real. I could feel its presence, heavy, like the air itself had thickened. I wanted to speak, to ask who or what it was, but my throat felt locked, as if something was pressing down on me. Then, slowly, the figure lifted an arm and pointed to the clock on my nightstand. I forced myself to look. The numbers were flickering, shifting in and out of focus. 3:12 a.m., then 4:59, then 2:01. The times jumped back and forth, erratic, just like in my vision. My chest tightened. Was this it? Had I failed? Was my time running out? The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but in the silence, I felt something. An understanding that came from somewhere beyond words. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting. I didn't know for what. A choice? A realization? All I knew was that whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that, staring at the flickering numbers, heart pounding so hard it felt like my chest might give out. I wanted to move, to say something, anything, but it was like my body didn't belong to me anymore. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. No movement, no fading away. One moment it was there, the next, it wasn't. I gasped, sucking in a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. My limbs were trembling, drenched in cold sweat. I sat up, grabbing the clock with shaking hands. The numbers had stopped flickering. 3:12 a.m., exactly where it had started. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, I sat there, gripping the edge of my bed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it another vision? A warning? Or was I finally losing my mind? The voice from my dream echoed in my head. You decide. But decide what? That was the part I still didn't understand. Had I done enough to change? Was I supposed to do more? Or was this presence, this thing, just here to remind me that no matter what I did, time would always be slipping away? The next morning, I felt like a man walking through a world that no longer felt solid. Everything seemed different. The way the light filtered through my bedroom window, the sound of my own footsteps on the cold floor, the distant hum of the city outside. But the worst part was the feeling, that creeping sensation that I was still being watched. Not in a paranoid way, not like someone was physically there. It was deeper than that, like time itself had eyes, like every second that passed was being measured. I tried to shake it off, to go through my routine like normal, but I couldn't. The weight of that night pressed on me, leaving me with one unavoidable truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. I had to do something. Sitting still felt like waiting for my own sentence to be handed down. So I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and drove, without a plan, without a destination. I just needed to move, to clear my head. My car cut through the morning traffic as I tried to outrun the thoughts clawing at my mind. Had the figure come to warn me? To test me? Or was it just there to watch me run out of time? My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. I needed answers. I needed to know if I had really been given a second chance, or if this was just the countdown to the end. I found myself driving toward a place I hadn't been in years, the cemetery where my father was buried. I didn't even realize where I was going until I saw the familiar iron gates, rusted at the edges, standing open like a silent invitation. My father had died when I was in my late 20s, right around the time I was starting to build my company. I had barely grieved him, barely had time, or at least that's what I told myself back then. Now, as I walked toward his grave, I felt the weight of every year I had spent avoiding this moment. The headstone was simple, worn down by time and weather. I stared at his name, the dates beneath it. Time had taken him, just like it would take me. I stood there for what felt like hours, but it was probably just minutes, long enough for the memories to surface. The late-night talks we used to have when I was younger, his voice telling me that success means nothing if you have no one to share it with. I had ignored that lesson. I had spent decades chasing numbers, power, status. And now, standing there, I realized something chilling. If I died today, would anyone stand over my grave the way I was standing over his? Would anyone visit? Would anyone even care? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut, and for the first time in years, I felt something deep and raw crack open inside me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at my father's grave, feeling that tightness in my chest grow heavier. Regret, that's what it was. Not just for him, but for all the moments I had let slip through my fingers, all the calls I never returned, the birthdays I skipped, the people I pushed away because I was too busy, too focused on what I thought really mattered. And now I was here, standing in front of a piece of stone, talking to someone who couldn't talk back. My throat burned. I wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain myself, but what good would it do? Time didn't care about apologies. It just kept moving. As I turned to leave, something strange happened. The air around me felt thicker, like the atmosphere had suddenly changed. The cemetery had been silent, just the occasional rustling of leaves. But now, everything was too quiet. No wind, no distant city noise, just a stillness that made my skin prickle. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, not a person, not an animal, just a dark shape standing near the trees at the edge of the cemetery, watching, waiting. My stomach twisted. Was it the same figure from my room? I didn't move, didn't even breathe, but I knew, with every fiber of my being, that whatever this was, it was here for me. I forced myself to blink, to look again, but the shadow was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. A cold sweat broke out along my back, and for a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind. Maybe it was just my guilt playing tricks on me. Or maybe it wasn't. I took a shaky breath and walked back to my car, my pulse hammering in my ears. As I gripped the steering wheel, something in me snapped. I couldn't keep doing this. Couldn't keep pretending I had all the time in the world when, for all I knew, the clock was already running out. That night, I sat in my living room, staring at my phone. There were so many people I needed to call, so many things I needed to say. But who do you start with when you've spent a lifetime putting yourself first? Who do you apologize to first? My hand hovered over my sister's number. We hadn't spoken in years. The last time we saw each other, it had ended in a fight, one that, at the time, I was sure I had won. But looking back now, I had lost much more than I had gained. I had lost her, and now I had no idea if she would even want to hear from me. After a long moment, I took a deep breath and pressed the call button. 1 ring, 2, 3. My chest tightened. Maybe she wouldn't answer. Maybe this was a mistake. Just as I was about to hang up, I heard her voice, cautious, uncertain. Julio? My throat went dry. I hadn't heard her say my name in years. I cleared my throat, trying to find the right words, but none of them felt good enough. Hey, it's me, I finally said. A long silence stretched between us. Then, in a tone I couldn't quite read, she asked, "Why are you calling?" For a split second, I considered lying, making up some excuse. But what was the point? I exhaled, running a hand down my face. Because I should have called a long time ago, I admitted. Because I was wrong. The words felt foreign in my mouth, heavy, but true. I don't expect you to forgive me, I hesitated, gripping the phone tighter. I don't know how much time I have left, and I don't want to waste it. Another silence, but this time, it felt different. Then, softly, she sighed. Julio, I don't either. That night, after I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, just breathing. The conversation with my sister had been short, careful, like two people stepping around broken glass. But it was a start, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. A crack in the wall I had built around myself. I should have felt relief, but instead, that same eerie sensation crept back over me, that feeling of being watched. My eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. 11:57 p.m. Something about the numbers made my stomach twist. It was almost as if they were waiting for something. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. I was exhausted. That was all. I forced myself to get up, go through the motions, wash my face, turn off the lights, get into bed. But the second my head hit the pillow, I knew I wouldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the events of the last few days. The vision, the shadow at the cemetery, the conversation with my sister. It all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle I didn't know how to solve. I turned onto my side, staring at the clock again. 11:59 p.m. The numbers flickered. My breath caught in my throat. No, not again. The flickering grew worse, erratic, unnatural, like the numbers were struggling to hold their shape. My heart pounded as I sat up, gripping the blanket like it could somehow anchor me to reality. Then, just as the clock struck 12:12 a.m., the entire room plunged into an unnatural stillness. No sound, no movement. Even the faint hum of the city outside had vanished. It was like time itself had stopped. And then, from the corner of the room, it appeared. The same dark figure, watching, waiting. But this time, there was no distance between us. It was in the room with me. A cold dread filled my chest, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure took a slow step forward, its presence somehow pressing against me like a weight I couldn't escape. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, more like a thought forced into my mind, it spoke. "Do you understand now?" My hands trembled. My mouth went dry. I wanted to say yes, to say no, to say anything, but all I could do was stare as the air around me seemed to bend, the walls of my room stretching like they weren't solid anymore. My time was still ticking, and this thing, it was here to make sure I didn't forget it. I forced myself to speak, my voice barely more than a whisper. Understand what? My own words felt foreign, like they barely belonged to me. The figure didn't move, but I could feel something shifting in the space around us, like reality itself was unstable. The air was thick, pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. Then, without warning, the flickering started again. Not from the clock this time, but from everything. The walls, the furniture, even my own hands seemed to glitch in and out, as if I were nothing more than an image struggling to stay in focus. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything snapped back. My room was normal again. The city noise returned. The weight on my chest lifted, but the figure was still there, standing in the exact same place, watching me with its hollow presence. And then it spoke again, this time clearer, deeper, resonating inside my skull like an undeniable truth. Your time is not measured by years. It is measured by what you do with what remains. My stomach dropped, because for the first time since this all started, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't a warning. It was a countdown. A shiver ran down my spine as the weight of those words settled in. Measured by what I do with what remains. It wasn't just about dying. It was about how I lived until then. I wanted to ask how much time I had left, but deep down, I already knew the answer. Not enough. My hands clenched into fists as I forced myself to hold the figure's gaze, if it even had eyes. And if I change? My voice cracked, barely audible. If I do things differently, does the time change too? The figure didn't respond right away. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, weighing something unseen. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and pointed toward the clock on the wall. I followed its gesture with my eyes. 12:01 a.m. The numbers were still. No flickering, no distortion. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Was that my answer? The time had moved, not stopped. It meant I still had a chance. The moment I looked back, the figure was gone, but I didn't need it to say anything else. I understood. I sat there, staring at the clock, my mind racing. The weight of everything I had seen, everything I had felt, was crushing. I was running out of time, but I wasn't out yet. My heart pounded as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my breath shaky. I needed to move. I needed to do something. Sitting still felt like surrender, like letting the countdown continue unchecked. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my contacts with trembling fingers. There were so many names I had ignored, so many people I had pushed away, but one name stood out above all the others. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the call button. My son. We hadn't spoken in years. The last conversation we had ended in a shouting match, my own words laced with arrogance, dismissing his feelings like they were nothing. He had needed me, and I had failed him. Now, I wasn't sure if he would even pick up. My chest tightened. Would this be enough? Would anything be enough? The figure's words echoed in my head, measured by what I do with what remains. I swallowed hard and pressed the call button, bracing myself for the answer, or the silence. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each second felt like an eternity. I prepared myself for the worst, that he wouldn't answer, that I had waited too long, that I had broken something beyond repair. But then, a click, a pause, and his voice, cautious but unmistakable. "Hello?" My throat tightened. It took me a moment to find my voice. "Hey, it's me." Silence. Not the kind that comes from a bad connection, but the kind that's heavy, full of things unsaid. I could almost hear the hesitation in his breathing, the careful calculation of whether this conversation was worth his time. I swallowed hard. I know this is unexpected, and I don't blame you if you don't want to talk. My voice was rough, unsteady. But I need you to know, I was wrong. The words felt foreign, but they were true. About a lot of things. About you. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But if I have any time left, any at all, I don't want to waste it, pretending I was right when I wasn't. Another silence. Then, finally, a breath, a shift. And then, why now? His voice wasn't angry, just tired. And I didn't have a good answer, not one that would make sense. So I told him the only thing I knew for sure, because I don't know how much time I have left. Another pause, longer this time. My grip tightened on the phone, my pulse hammering in my ears. I expected him to hang up. I wouldn't blame him if he did. But then he sighed, soft, almost imperceptible. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter now. "Neither do I." Something in my chest twisted, not from fear this time, but from regret. I had spent years convincing myself that I had all the time in the world to fix things. But time doesn't wait, and neither do the people we push away. "I want to see you," I blurted out before I could lose my nerve. "If you'll let me." Another silence. But this one felt different, lighter, less like a wall and more like a door that had been cracked open, just enough to see through. "I don't know," he admitted. "I need to think." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "That's fair." My fingers trembled as I rubbed my forehead. The clock was still ticking, but for the first time, I felt like I was moving with it instead of against it. After we hung up, I just sat there, staring at the phone in my hand. I had done it. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was something, a start. And yet, as relief started creeping in, that familiar unease returned, like a cold breath against the back of my neck. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the dark room. Nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. It was still here, watching, waiting. The hair on my arms stood on end as I looked toward the clock again. 12:07 a.m. The numbers were still, too still, like they weren't just marking time anymore. They were holding it. A shiver ran down my spine as the air in the room thickened, pressing against me like an invisible force. And then I saw it. Not in the corner this time. Closer. The dark figure stood at the foot of my bed, unmoving, its presence heavier than before. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. And then, without sound, without motion, a single chilling thought pressed into my mind. This was only the beginning. A deep, unnatural cold spread through the room, seeping into my bones. I wanted to move, to run, to do anything but sit there frozen under its gaze. But my body refused to respond. It wasn't fear that held me in place. It was something else, something stronger. Like an unseen force was keeping me exactly where I was meant to be. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Just its presence alone was enough to drown out every rational thought. every excuse, every bit of denial I had left. This wasn't over. Whatever was happening to me, whatever this was, it had only just begun. And then, just like that, the weight lifted. The air became breathable again. My muscles loosened, and the tension that had locked me in place disappeared. But I didn't feel relief, because when I blinked, the figure was gone. But the sense of urgency, the awareness that my time was still slipping away, remained. I turned back to the clock. 12:08 a.m. The numbers were no longer still. They were moving, slowly, steadily. But I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere the countdown hadn't stopped. It had only reset. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I expected to wake up in that dark space again, with the flickering clock and the crushing weight of my own regrets. But morning came like it always did, almost too normal, too ordinary. Sunlight leaked through the blinds. The distant hum of the city filled the silence. And for a brief moment, I could almost convince myself that everything had been a dream. Almost. But then my eyes landed on the clock by my bedside. 7:32 a.m. The numbers looked normal now, but I knew better. I knew something had changed. I moved through the day in a haze, distracted, restless. I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was still keeping track, still watching. Every time I passed a clock, on my phone, on a wall, even the dashboard of my car, I felt a chill creep up my spine. What if this wasn't just about how much time I had left? What if it was about how I used it? The thought stuck with me as I stared at my phone again, my son's name still at the top of my recent calls. I had made contact, but was that enough? The weight of the question sat heavy in my chest. Because if last night had taught me anything, it was this. The clock hadn't stopped, and I was still running out of time. The rest of the day felt like a test. Every little decision, every small action, carried a weight I had never noticed before. When my assistant called about a last-minute meeting, I almost said yes. Out of habit, out of routine. But then I hesitated. Was this how I wanted to spend my time? Instead, I told her to reschedule. She sounded surprised. I had never done that before. And yet, the moment I hung up, something strange happened. A flicker in the corner of my vision. I turned sharply toward the office clock. 2:14 p.m. But for just a second, barely even a heartbeat, it didn't look right. The numbers warped, twisting unnaturally, before snapping back into place. I swallowed hard. It was real. It wasn't just in my head. Whatever force had shown me that vision, whatever presence had been in my hospital room, it was still with me, watching, measuring. The realization sent a cold shiver down my spine. This wasn't just about saying the right words or making empty gestures. I had to mean it. The clock wouldn't be fooled. And if I was being honest with myself, I didn't know if I could change fast enough. By the time I got home that evening, the weight of the day was pressing down on me. Every interaction, every choice felt like a calculation. Had I done enough? Had I wasted too much time? The awareness of the clock never left me. It wasn't paranoia. It was something deeper, something I could feel. Like an invisible thread tied me to it, pulling tighter with every passing hour. I stood in my living room, staring at the framed photos on the wall. My wife, my son, smiling faces from a time when I still had them, when I still deserved them. I clenched my jaw, a sickening thought creeping in. What if the clock wasn't counting down to my death? What if it was counting down to the moment when I lost my chance to make things right? The thought struck me so hard, I had to sit down. What if I wasn't being warned about dying, but about living wrong? My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone again. I couldn't just sit here, drowning in guilt. I had to do something. I scrolled back to my son's name, my thumb hovering over the call button. But before I could press it, the power in the apartment flickered. A short buzz, then darkness, silence. And in that silence, I heard it. A single, deliberate tick, not from any clock I could see, but from something else. something closer. I held my breath, ears straining in the darkness. Tick. The sound came again, deliberate, heavy, not mechanical, not normal. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. A weak beam of light cut through the shadows, sweeping over the furniture. Nothing. But the feeling, the same suffocating presence I had felt in the hospital, was stronger now, closer. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stand. The power outage didn't make sense. The building had a backup generator. Even in the worst storms, the lights had never gone out like this. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. It was intentional. I turned toward the hallway, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. But I had to know. I had to see. As I took a slow step forward, the flashlight flickered. For a split second, the beam distorted, stretching unnaturally, like something unseen was bending the light itself. And then, it went out. My stomach twisted. I wasn't alone. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached out blindly, feeling my way toward the nearest wall. That's when I heard it, a whisper, so faint, so low, that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But I hadn't, because this time, the words were clear. Time's running out. I spun around, my pulse hammering in my ears. The whisper had been right behind me, but there was nothing. Just empty darkness pressing in from all sides. My hands were clammy as I fumbled for my phone, desperately trying to turn the flashlight back on. Nothing. The screen stayed black. The air around me grew heavier, thicker, like the very space I was standing in was collapsing inward. And then, tick, tick, louder this time. More urgent. I wasn't just hearing it anymore. I could feel it. Each sound reverberated through my chest, rattling inside my ribs like a second heartbeat. Something was counting down. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The power surged back, flooding the apartment with light. My phone screen blinked on in my hand, displaying the time. 11:59 p.m. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't possible. The last time I had checked, it had barely been 8 p.m. Where had the last 3 hours gone? A cold dread settled over me as I realized the truth. I hadn't lost time. It had been taken. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. 3 hours. Gone. Had I blacked out? Had something happened that I couldn't remember? My body didn't feel like it had been asleep. I felt drained, hollow, like something had reached inside me and pulled something out. My hands trembled as I checked my call history, my messages. Nothing. No missed calls, no texts, no sign that I had done anything at all. But deep in my gut, I knew that wasn't true. Something had happened, and whatever it was, it had taken more than just time. Then, the clock changed. 12:03 a.m. Midnight, the exact moment the ticking had stopped. And in that silence, in the stillness of my apartment, I felt it. An ending, or maybe a beginning. The realization hit me like ice water. The countdown hadn't been to my death. It had been to this. Whatever had been watching me, whatever force had been keeping track, it had made its move. And now, there was no going back. A sharp knock at the door made me jump. My stomach twisted. Who the hell would be here at this hour? I hesitated, every instinct telling me not to open it. But something else, something stronger, made me move forward. My hand hovered over the doorknob. Tick, tick. The sound returned, but this time, it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from the other side of the door. My throat tightened. This was it. The moment everything had been leading up to. I took a slow, unsteady breath and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing nothing. The hallway outside was empty, eerily silent. But as I stepped forward, my foot hit something. A package. Small, plain. No name, no address. My pulse thundered as I crouched down and picked it up, hands shaking. I already knew what was inside. Before I even opened it, I knew. Because the ticking sound? It was coming from the box. With trembling fingers, I peeled back the paper and lifted the lid. A clock. Small, old-fashioned, with a brass frame and a glass cover. But this wasn't just any clock. It was the same one, the same design, the same warped movement of the hands, shifting too fast, then too slow, the same impossible ticking that I had heard in the darkness. My chest tightened. It had followed me. Or maybe it had never really left. I reached out, almost afraid to touch it, but as soon as my fingers brushed the glass, the hands stopped, completely frozen. The air in the room seemed to thicken, a weight pressing down on me. And then, just as my breath caught in my throat, the hands began to move again, backward. I dropped the clock, stumbling away as a wave of nausea rolled through me. What the hell did that mean? My mind raced, searching for answers that didn't exist. And then it hit me. The time I had lost. The countdown. It wasn't over. It was still happening, but in reverse. My second chance wasn't about getting more time. It was about undoing what I had done. Or maybe undoing me. A cold sweat broke out on my skin as I stared at the clock, its hands spinning faster and faster. And in that moment, I knew, whatever time I had left, it wasn't mine anymore.